Welcome to Mysterious Goings On, the podcast about creativity, writing, and mystery. Every week, we talk about all kinds of great fiction and meet the people who write it. We also feature explorations about creativity in all walks of life. Your host, Alex Greenwood, will join you right after this.
Hi, this is Punya Ngene, author of The Bodies That Move, and you're listening to Mysterious Goings On.
You know, they talk about the great American dream, or maybe it's a myth. I don't know. I don't happen to think it's a myth, but the great American dream of charting your own course, blazing your own trail, or simply living life on your own terms. And that, my friends, is what drove me to not walk, but run to schedule an interview with today's guest. I am excited to introduce you to Ed Davis. For the current boom in van life and nomadic living, Ed Davis rode the rails, hopping boxcars and freight trains from Reno to Vancouver, through the Sierras and up and down the Golden State. As a young man, he lived on $5 a day, worked as a carny, and even slept under the same bridge Kerouac once did. Living as a part-time hobo, he and his friends, the Knights of the Road, experienced a world that no longer exists. Those treks across the country eventually led Ed to become a successful businessman, a champion discus thrower, and a loving husband to his wife, Jan, who on occasion has even hopped the trains with him. So we're going to talk to him today about his uniquely American experience. He brings with us this latest novel, The Last Professional. It's a compelling story of two men linked by a yearning to explore and experience a simpler way of living. In the vein of Kerouac and London, Davis paints a rich tapestry of life on the move, where adventure is truly just a freight car away. Ed Davis, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Alex, I am thrilled to be here. Really looking forward to talking about writing with you.
I got to get at this. What did it for you? What was the first time? Was it a kind of a call of a locomotive as a little boy? What was it?
Well, I think I may have train travel in my DNA, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The first episode, though, came in 1972. A friend and I had been working at Sonoma State Hospital here in Northern California as psychiatric technicians. He and I shared in common that neither of us knew our fathers, but he got a lead on his, and he was supposed to be in an island off the coast of Scotland. And so we cashed in our chips. In those days, you could buy an open-ended ticket from Kennedy to Heathrow that you could use anytime for $200. And so, okay, we can get to the UK. How are we going to get to Kennedy? Well, we'll hitchhike. You know, it's 1972. Everybody's hitchhiking, no problem. Well, Paul was 6'4". I'm 6 foot. We were both football players, and we had these gigantic backpacks, metal frame backpacks that we bought from the Army surplus store. Nobody was stopping to give us a ride. We were too damn big. We just wouldn't fit. And so finally, a guy, I think was up in Crescent City, in a van, pulled over and said, "You guys are out of your minds. Nobody's going to give you a lift. You should be riding freight trains." Riding freight trains? That's a thing you can do. He had done it. He gave us some pointers. He dropped us off in Eugene, Oregon. Half an hour later, we were on a flat car, heading west, wind in our hair, sun on our backs. I was hooked. I never looked back.
Man, that is just so incredible. That is so incredible. I can just remember growing up where a place, and I grew up in Oklahoma, and I just remember every night I would hear the horn, and I, we're talking about you're a little boy and you're all snuggled in your bed, and that horn can be kind of scary when you're little, but as you get older, it's actually to me, it's a call. It's like, you got to get out of here one of these days, boy. And I never did it the way you did. I'd love to ask you about the train hopping, though, a little bit. Now, is it truly a lost art? Is it done?
It's still being done. It's harder and harder than ever. And let's call this the public service portion of this show, which is, it is very illegal. It's extremely dangerous. People die all the time doing this, even now. Because the trains are very fast. They're faster than they ever were. There are very few places to ride, And so, and they're just unforgiving. If you get in the way, you just get dead. Yeah. So, folks at home, don't try this. If you want to have a vicarious adventure, read my book. but in answer to your question, when I was writing, the last of the old time hobos were still doing it.
Oh, wow.
And it's a lost era. But if you dial back in history a little bit, after the Civil War, we're going way back, Transcontinental Railroad came in. We've got a country that's been torn apart, guys coming home from the military, they don't recognize themselves, there's no place for them at home. And suddenly there was, within a few miles of their front door, they could get on a train and go anywhere. It was the equivalent to the internet for us 20 years ago. It abolished time and space. And so people took to the road in extraordinary numbers, hundreds of thousands. And so there's this very rich heritage. When I started writing, it was just at the tail end of it. Now there are folks doing it for the adventure, frankly, with GoPros on. Yeah, I mean, you can go on YouTube, you can look up freight hopping. You can find, there are a lot of guys who are doing it right. They're being safe, they're being respectful. They're doing it because of the love of the experience, which I totally understand. So yeah, it's still being done, but please do not try it if you're listening to this.
Yeah, please don't, because the Legal Defense Fund alone would break this podcast. H.L. Mencken said in the American language, tramps and hobos are commonly lumped together, but in their own psyche, they are sharply differentiated. I'm bringing this up, by the way, Ed, because you knew some of these folks, but he said a hobo or beau is simply a migratory laborer. He may take some longish holidays, but sooner or later he returns to work. A tramp never works if it can be avoided. He simply travels. Lower than either, he said, is the bum who neither works nor travels, save when impelled by the notion of the police.
Yep. I first heard a very abbreviated version of that. A hobo works and wonders. A tramp wonders, a bum does neither. But relative to my book, The Last Professional, in this category of hobo, there was a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so there were the guys, most people who really did it as a means of getting from job to job. Hobos were journeymen of manual labor. They had a lot of skills. During tough times, this was before the automobile was widely available. So this is how you got around. But for a small subset of them, something about the lifestyle spoke to them. And it's sort of analogous to the guys who go surfing every day, even if the waves are bad, the guys who run 50 marathons a year, the guys who walk the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail once a year. They're doing it because it's feeding their soul in a way that nothing else does. The professional hobos were those guys. Yeah,
exactly. And they had a code, didn't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You might share a little bit about that. I don't think people really understand this. I think people too easily make the equivalency that they were just bums. They're not. But these were dignified. Not everybody, but
right.
By and large, dignified gentlemen of the road. Could you tell us a little bit about the code?
Sure. It like any society, it had a strata, and there were those who lived by the code and those who lived against it. Frankly. There was a hobo convention in St. Louis in the late 1880s, 1890s, where they drafted a hobo code of ethics. And it looks remarkably like our own Declaration of Independence. Yeah. It's basically, be respectful, take care of yourself, don't make trouble in a town. Another hobo's going to be coming by to help you out. Take care of the kids, try to get them home. I mean, very simple rules that these guys lived by. They had a network of hobo jungles that were essentially like camps. Every town that had a railroad yard had a hobo jungle. Something that people don't understand today is that at their height, I think I've got the statistic right, 90% of the population of the United States lived within 5 miles of a train track. That's not true anymore. But so every little town had, particularly in the days of steam, they had a railroad track, they had a water tank, and they had a hobo jungle. And the jungles had very strict rules. You left it better than you found it. You would come in and there'd be tin cans washed and hung upside down on the trees so that you could cook. There'd be people would tell you where you might be able to get a handout in town and where you couldn't. Very, very strict but simple rules so that you could come into a town, get a meal, be on your way.
Yeah. What I was just impressed with too, like you said, try to stay clean and boil up wherever possible. Do not cause problems in a train yard. Another hobo will be coming along who will need passage through that yard, right?
Yeah. Just simple rules. And when I was starting to ride, those days were pretty much gone. The old guys still adhered to that code, but there were, drugs were becoming really prevalent, and there were serial killers riding the rails not long after I was on, and some pretty famous ones, because in this subculture, the law didn't care.
See, when you said 1972, particularly the part of the country you're from, I got to be honest, I thought of serial killers because you weren't right by the Green River or anything.
Absolutely. Zodiac was in our neck of the woods, just down the road.
Oh, geez. I mean, and does it ever occur to you that I'm not sure, I'm not saying you ever came across them, but that maybe in your travels, you might have come across some pretty.
Almost certainly. Fortunately, at least when I was traveling, folks tended to keep a fairly respectful distance. If you got in a boxcar and somebody else was in there, you would pretty quickly establish that you weren't a threat to them and they weren't a threat to you. And if it looked like that was the case, you got the hell out.
Wow.
Because it was a lawless, it was kind of the Wild West on the rails. There was really no authority. All the railroad bulls, the railroad police, all they really cared about was protecting railroad property, not protecting you.
Yeah. Talk to me about how you got into writing.
It is related to trains, interestingly. When I took this first trip I described to you, one of the first tips we got was that riding across the United States was challenging because the rail lines go so many different places. So it's really easy to get sidetracked locally. You can get on a train, at midnight thinking you're going to end up 500 miles east and wake up 500 miles south. And so a lot of the guys working in the yards in those days had ridden themselves when they were young men. And so you could get advice from them. And the very first advice we got was go to Canada, because there's only one set of tracks going east and west. So, with some exceptions, there's some lines that go up to the up north, but mostly if you're on the rails in Canada, you know where you're going. And so that's where we went. I was newly in a relationship with Jan, who has been my wife now going on a whole lot of years, which is great. And so I was writing letters to her. I had discovered this new form of travel that just spoke to something in me that I didn't even know existed. And somehow putting those two things together, this new romance, this new way of seeing the world with words in those letters, it was like alchemy. It pulled it together for me in a way that said, I want more of this. This is what I should be doing.
There's a lot of your work at Sonoma State Hospital. And that led to In All Things, right?
Right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that.
I had volunteered, biology teacher who thought we should expand our horizons. At that time, Sonoma State Hospital was the largest institution for what were then called the mentally retarded in the United States. There were 3,500 residents. Yeah, it was huge. Something, again, about it spoke to me. I got out of high school. I'd been a football player, and it didn't work out going to play for some of the schools that were interested in me. So instead of going to college, I took a course through the local JC to become a psychiatric technician. And it was an extraordinary experience. Very little had changed in terms of the care of the mentally retarded for 50 years. So there was a fair amount of it that was pretty medieval. And it was just the standard of the time. And some of that I capture in All Things. Thank goodness it was right at the cusp of when it was changing.
Yeah.
And by the time the institution closed just a couple of years ago, its standard of care was exceptional. It was a model for the rest of the country. But when I was there, it was human warehousing. And yeah,
exactly the word I was getting ready to use. I mean, there was, and this is my words, not yours. Society's shame. Let's put them away. Let's warehouse them. Right? Was that the case?
It was encouraged. I mean, and so much has changed. If you had a child with cerebral palsy in 1950 or 55, quite likely the doctor would say, you can't adequately care for this child. You should give him to the state. And that was done commonly. And yeah, when I was there, they had just passed a law in California that adult residents who could demonstrate that they were competent could apply for self-emancipation so that they could apply to get themselves out. And Jan and I helped a couple of people do that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, yeah, I mean, even President Kennedy had a sister who he never really knew because, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely true.
And of course, I kind of leapt over kind of where you started too. You had Road Stories, of course,
Right.
which was talking about how you caught trains and vagabonded around the Pacific Northwest in Canada. We'll go to the writing part of this, though.
Okay.
Did you have a notebook on you? How did you take note? Tell me about that a little bit, would you? Just what was that like?
Spiral notebook, Final Light, Bic ball. You could get a great Bic ballpoint pen for 39 cents. That would write anywhere. It would write underwater, I swear to God. And so, yeah, that was the deal. And The Last Professional actually began in a boxcar outside Watsonville, California one night. I wrote the first lines of it there. So I have found that it isn't essential for me to travel to write, but man, when I travel, I want to write.
I think that's fascinating. Now I didn't do what you did, but anytime I go on a vacation or even a business trip, what is that about that? I get jazzed. I want to write.
Well, what I think's going on is that I don't ever think we see ourselves more clearly than when we're against an unfamiliar backdrop. So we're in a new setting, we're in new surroundings. Our awareness is heightened, not only of what's going on around us if we're writers, because we're always watching, but it's like we get to see ourselves in a different way when we travel. And I think I'll write in Denny's, I'll write in hotel lobbies, I'll write I do some of my best work in hotel lobbies.
A lot of my series takes place in Key West, and it's my wife's used to it. I'll walk around with it used to be a little recorder. Now you can just use your phone, right? I'll just talk into it. Chickens running past us. The scooter just went by. All of this stuff. But Key West, nobody looks at you twice because everybody's weird down there. You would write that, and then I assume you'd get back to home base eventually, and you had a typewriter, and you'd go at it, right?
Yeah, I originally all wrote longhand, and that's doing a disservice to longhand, calling what I do longhand. But yellow tablets. For those at home, I'm holding up a yellow tablet.
Yep.
I should have invested in them 60 years ago. But I figured out I'm a very fast typist, and I figured out that I needed to learn how to compose in a typewriter. So I bought an old IBM Selectric typewriter, Army surplus thing, must have weighed 50 pounds. And it must have been 1979, 1980. I wrote a novel in a week. The novel's gone. I can barely remember what it's like, but I forced myself to compose at the keyboard. And then I've never looked back. And boy, were computers and word processing ever made for me. Poor Kerouac had to tie together teletype paper, and all we have to do is just keep hitting enter.
I can remember that we spoke offline about my grandfather, and you mentioned that, kindly mentioned about that, looking about his book I wrote with him posthumously. But anyway, I can still remember, though, towards the end of his life, he was just always, should I get one of those computer things, and all that. So we settled once. Do you remember, Ed? You'll remember this. Do you remember the kind of the halfway mark? I had one. It's an electric typewriter, but it had a little green computer screen in it, and you could edit. And then you hit print when it's allegedly okay, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, my first computer was an Osborne that was advertised as being portable. It was really luggable. It weighed about 40 pounds and had a screen that couldn't have been more than 5 inches diagonal. Yeah.
Luggable. I love it. Before we just kind of go on, I ask you all these little silly questions about writing
Oh, they're
itself.
all good, man.
Let's talk about The Last Professional. Though. This is not, though, folks. This is not nonfiction. Now, it's obviously very well influenced by Ed's life, but tell us about the book. Tell us what we're looking at here. It's a gorgeous book, and it's got illustrations and everything. But please, I'll let you tell everybody about it.
Well, I think that, and you'll probably chime in here, I hope. I think much, if not most, good fiction is in some way autobiographical. Mm-hmm. I think we pull from our experience. And so when I wrote this book, I was 27, 28 years old. I had fallen in love with the rails, and I was looking for a way to capture that and share it. I mean, basically, I just wanted to capture this life. And so I wrote it very quickly. There are two main characters. There's a young man, Lyndon, who was very much like me, same age, didn't know his father, had been sexually abused as a boy, as I was. So there's a lot of commonality there. And I think a theme, particularly in a lot of Western literature, is young men looking for their fathers. And so he is sort of looking for that father figure, and he finds one in the last professional, this old hobo who is near the end of his days. And so really the book is about the young man trying to come to grips with the trauma of his past so he can move forward, and the older man, his mentor, hanging on to what is a vanishing way of life. I didn't know at the time, but I think that's the challenge that every generation faces. I think about us today socially. The young people in our generation are trying to come to grips with the traumas and the things we as a society have done in our past.
Yeah.
The older among us are trying to hang on to the way of life that we remember, and we see it vanishing so much. Like your grandfather, do I want one of these computer things? I hope I'm not going to get in trouble with anybody who watched the Super Bowl. I had kids who loved the Super Bowl halftime. My children, who are now in their 40s, it was great. I was reaching for Led Zeppelin, I mean.
You're in a safe space here. Don't worry.
Yeah. And so I think what ends up happening in The Last Professional in terms of thematically is it's young man trying to come to grips with the trauma of his past, older man trying to hang on to the code he's always lived by, and a vanishing way of life, and the friendship that develops between them.
What moves me a lot about your work, your writing, Ed, is you really paint a wonderful picture with dialogue.
Oh, thank you.
I'm partial to that. I write that way myself. I don't know. People tell me I kind of write like I'm writing a movie. I don't intend to. I'm not saying you're writing like a movie, but I'm just saying you go through this. And I mean, I was this wonderful stuff, just wonderful little, don't run off. I'm going to read some of this. Okay. And I'm going to read it out of context, but I just want this is great here. Tom, he picked a piece of tobacco off his tongue, took another drag. That guy's so yellow, he wouldn't shoot a can for fear it'd shoot him back. Tom's all wind, he exhaled, squinted at them through the smoke, twisted his nose. Kind of a foul smelling wind, if you know what I mean. Dude, really? I mean, you don't even know who that guy is, but you know who that guy is. It is throughout. And that's, folks, what you can't see it. I'm like waving the book around it. Poor Ed, and he's like, calm down, it's all right. But it's got these wonderful, it's not a graphic novel, but it's got like kind of that graphic novel every now and then. Tell me about that choice. Is that a callback to something previous, or
Absolutely. Yeah, it's, as you've probably gathered, the formative novels for me were the great American fiction of 100 years ago. And so it's Hemingway, it's Steinbeck, it's Fitzgerald, it's Thomas Wolfe. A little later, Harper Lee. Those are the people who really spoke to me. Those classic literary novels of the 20s, 30s, and 40s were often illustrated. They weren't heavily illustrated, but there was often a little bit through them. There's a great edition, a Random House edition of Moby Dick that came out in the 1930s, illustrated by Rockwell Kent. And if you can get a copy of it, it's worth it just for the illustrations. Ooh. They're black and white woodcuts. Yeah. And it's like It's like illustrations speak to us. Well, if you think about it, we were communicating in pictures before we were communicating in words. And so they get to us in a way that the narrative itself, it complements it. It's a whole different way of accessing the story. And so, and I was blessed to find Colin Elgee, who did these illustrations. The guy is outstanding.
He really is. He really is. You know, you said woodcuts. It's so, I mean, you know, you just look at that and it just, to me, that's what it looks like, something out of that period. And that's, it's elegant and it's fun, just a delight. And I don't often admit this to my guests, but I got this about 4 days ago, so I didn't get to read. I started and I'm really excited about it, but Ed, I hope you forgive me, but I will read it because I think it looks incredible. I'm thrilled that you're enjoying it. That's all any writer wants. When people say that they liked the book or liked it, I just say, I hope it entertains you. That's what I always tell people, because that's all I'm trying to do is just give you some moment away from your own life a little bit, and maybe you'll see something in there. But what's this about you taking to the rails, so to speak, on a whistle stop tour? What are you doing?
That's going to be so much fun. The whole month of April, it's 15 cities, 30 days, 6,500 miles. And near as I can tell, nobody's done anything like it for about 100 years. I'm really doing everything I can to support local bookstores. Amazon doesn't need my help selling books. Local bookstores do. And so we're trying to arrange events everywhere we can where we can draw some attention, not only to the book, but to the bookstore through this unique way of getting out and spreading the word. And for a story that takes place on the rails, what better way than a book tour on the rails?
Man, I hope Amtrak's giving you a little.
Well, if you have Amtrak on speed dial, please call them.
I think we also need to get CBS Sunday Morning on the trail for you too. I think this has got Steve Hartman written all over it. But anyway, this is great. I love this. That's so imaginative, such a creative thing to do, and such a damn fine thing to do for our independent bookstores who, they're struggling, they need it. And Mr. Bezos doesn't need another rocket. He can do just fine without that. So
exactly.
And I encourage everybody to look for The Last Professional. There'll be links to Ed's website in the show notes. And of course, go find it. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, they can order it, right?
Amen.
They can order it. Ed, I mean, I feel like I just scratched the surface with you, but I promise I'd only keep you a half hour. But I tell you what, I'd love to have you back sometime. I'd like to. I don't think we really even got anywhere near as far deep as I wanted to on this. I've enjoyed meeting you and talking to you so much.
It would be an absolute pleasure. Maybe we'll do it from midway on the train trip. I'll talk to you from a train station someplace. Wouldn't that be fun?
The door is open here, man. I'm telling you, man, if you want to get a little sidetracked there and just take a pause, let me know. I'd love to have you on. We'll talk from there and how it's going on the road. You know, folks, I think I used to think people who hop trains were running away from something, but I think Ed's kind of showing me that maybe, no, they're not running away from something. They're actually finding something. It sounds to me, Ed Davis, like you found something on the rails, and I think readers are blessed that you're sharing it with them.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Ed Davis. Again, the book is The Last Professional. He's got other works too. There'll be links in the show notes. Don't hop off that treadmill. Don't stop the car. Don't worry about it. It's going to be in your show notes, or it'll be at mgopod.com, but it's at eddavisbooks.com. You can learn a lot more about this gentleman. And I didn't even talk to you about everything he's done, but don't worry. He's already said he's coming back. I've got it on the tape. All right. Again, Ed, thanks so much. And we'll see you on the railroad.
You got it.
Have you lost your belief in finding a really good mystery thriller? Well, trust me, you've got to have faith. Pilot's faith. Kirkus Reviews says of the book that Greenwood pulls many tricks from his writer's satchel, has a quirkiness and energy, and snappy, snarky dialogue that keeps things moving briskly. A well-handled mystery with the appropriate twist at the end. Midwest Book Review says newcomers to Pilot will find no barriers to quick immersion in his personality and situation, while prior series readers immediately become involved in another conundrum which tests his skills and the ways in which others view him in his world. Surviving a recent attempt on his life, a weary John Pilot returns to Cross Township, where a bizarre string of shootings has paralyzed the tiny college burg. Pilot joins forces with the law to find out why people are being terrorized in his name and stop it. Unfortunately, when he turns to his family for support, he finds only hardened hearts. People are dying, accusing fingers are being pointed his way, and he has nowhere left to turn. Everything John Pilot believes in, family, sanity, and even himself, are shaken to the core in Pilot's faith. Online Book Club says, "It's a gripping and fun story that kept me hooked. Greenwood's writing style is dynamic, and the book reads like a movie script." You can get John Pilot Series number 8, Pilot's Faith, exclusively in paperback and ebook on Amazon.com. And remember, in the end, it all comes down to faith. Pilot's Faith. A Caroline Street Press book by J. Alexander Greenwood.
Thanks for joining us on Mysterious Goings On. Be sure to follow Mysterious Goings On wherever you get your podcast and never miss an episode. Don't forget, you can get the links to books and other things mentioned on the show at mgopod.com. Until next time, keep reading.